Katie Buitrago. I'm the director of the Social Impact Research Center at Heartland Alliance, and I'm excited to talk to you today about our latest report on Illinois poverty, Cycle of Risk, the intersection of poverty, violence, and trauma. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have questions, just enter them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues, you can also put those in the chat box and we'll try to help you out with that. Now getting started. Heartland Alliance has been releasing the annual report on Illinois poverty for 17 years now. And we started releasing this report when we saw that there were a lot of misconceptions from the public, from the media, from policymakers about who lives in poverty and what the causes of poverty are. We decided to take a deeper look and try to document exactly who is in poverty and what the causes are beyond just high-level economic indicators. And we wanted to lay a foundation for policy change. And the poverty report has served to educate and spur to action hundreds of thousands of people throughout the years. This report is a compilation of some of the best data and research we have at our disposal to understand poverty and racial disparities in Illinois. Some of the information is from our own analyses of census data, state data, and local data. And some of the information is from national studies and research. We distilled and analyzed information from probably 100 sources to document the experience of poverty and racial inequity in Illinois. And you'll notice that some of the data are not Illinois specific. Unfortunately, statistics by race at the state or local level are often not available or not reported. And that's problematic because it's hard, without hard data, to document disparities that vary at the community level. But we've, whenever possible, are using local level data. So first, to take a look at who is living in poverty in Illinois and who poverty is impacting. Poverty is still a significant problem for many Illinoisans. Almost 1/3 of Illinoisans are considered poor or low income, and 2 in 5 Chicagoans are considered poor or low income. And to give you a sense of what it means to be living in poverty, the federal poverty line has not been updated in decades. And for a family of 3, it's about $18,000 to $19,000. So we're talking about real extreme deprivation here. Poverty remains basically where it was during the recession. Even though the recession is technically over, it hasn't lifted all boats. You can see in 2010, 13.8% of Illinoisans were living in poverty, and now it's still 13.6%. And where people living in poverty live is changing as well. It's becoming increasingly suburbanized. In the Chicago region, in 2000, 1/3 of the region's poor lived in the suburbs, and in 2015, nearly half of the region's poor lived in the suburbs. Poverty is also becoming increasingly concentrated. The number of poor people living in extreme poverty neighborhoods in Chicago has grown by 384% since 2000. And we're talking about neighborhoods where more than 40% of the people live in poverty. So that means that, people living in poverty are not less and less integrated into communities with a diverse range of income backgrounds. They're getting more and more isolated within neighborhoods that are isolated, lack resources, and these neighborhoods are more likely to have conditions that foster violence. They're more likely to have older and poorly maintained buildings that increase children's exposure to lead, more vacant buildings that reduce neighborhood appeal and provide venues for illegal activity, difficulties attracting businesses and employment opportunities, and poorer schools that offer limited educational opportunities. Poverty does not strike people equally in Illinois. Virtually all research on poverty shows that people of color are at much greater risk of experiencing poverty across all age groups and across generations than white people are. You can see the overall poverty rate by race in Illinois. 28.2% of Black people live in poverty compared to 19% of Latinos and just 9% of white people. You can see children, women, and people of color have the highest poverty rates. Nearly 40% of Black children in Illinois are living in poverty, and that's just staggering. That means that Black children are nearly 4 times as likely to live below the poverty line than white children are. And poverty is often talked about as a Chicago problem, but it's an issue throughout the entire state. You can see this map shows poverty rates in all the counties in Illinois. The darkest counties have the highest rates of poverty. So you can see, Cook County is right there in the middle, but many downstate and central Illinois counties have higher rates of poverty. And living in areas that might not have the same social service infrastructure that Chicago has can exacerbate the experience of living in poverty outside of urban areas. Like I said, looking at just income poverty is not quite telling the full picture of the experience of quality of life of people who live in poverty. When we look at quality of life domains beyond just the poverty rate, you can see that the racial disparities persist across the board on every single quality of life domain. Illinoisans of color have poverty rates that are 2 to 3 times higher than white people. They have unemployment rates that are 1.4 to 2.4 times higher. They are 2 times more likely to be food insecure. They have high school graduation rates that are 10 to 15 percentage points lower, and they are 2 to 3 times more likely to be uninsured. And if these differences were just on a handful of outcomes, that would be one thing, but these differences are remarkably persistent across the board. The uncomfortable truth is that we haven't made nearly as much progress on issues of racial equity as many may think. So this year, the particular focus we took in our report on Illinois poverty was looking at the intersections of poverty, violence, and trauma, and how similar conditions foster poverty and violence. As everyone knows, Chicago is facing a crisis of lethal violence, and communities across Illinois are struggling with staggering rates of poverty. Our research shows that these 2 factors are interconnected. The same forces that foster poverty also put people at risk of violence: the lack of good paying jobs, limited educational opportunities, and a lack of access to key services. And experiencing violence is traumatic. Trauma has negative effects on people's lives, from making it hard to succeed in school and at work, which makes it hard to rise out of poverty, to raising the likelihood of aggressive behavior, which influences rates of violence. So you can see in that way that trauma further feeds into both the cycle of poverty and violence. In order to stop violence before it starts, we need to invest in our communities and help people heal from trauma. So while violence in Chicago and Illinois has declined for decades, Chicago experienced a huge uptick in violence in 2016. The rise in violence in Chicago was sudden and dramatic. Between 2015 and 2016, murders in Chicago grew by 58%, and non-fatal shootings grew by 43%. And a staggering 764 people were murdered in Chicago in 2016. People of color in Illinois are disproportionately impacted by violence. Black men aged 15 to 44 comprised over half of homicide victims in Illinois in 2015, while they make up just 3% of the state's population. In Chicago, Black men comprised almost 80% of homicide victims in 2016, compared to 1/3 of the city's population. And Black people in Chicago are victims of non-fatal shootings at a rate that is more than twice as high as the citywide average, and a staggering 70 times higher than whites. So you can see that being a victim of violence is not an equally distributed likelihood, and some people are much more at risk than others. Another group that is much more likely to be a victim of violent crime are people who live in poverty. Looking at this national data, you can see that people with the lowest incomes are much more likely to be a victim of any type of violent crime than people with the highest incomes. People with the lowest incomes per year experience a rate of violent victimization that is over 200% higher than people with the highest incomes. And violence is an issue in all types of communities. In many ways, where you live determines the opportunities and threats that you face every day. Neighborhoods that struggle with disinvestment and vacancy often experience more violent crime. Neighborhood-level characteristics, such as concentrated poverty and proximity to previous homicides, are predictors of higher homicide rates. while the strength of neighborhood social ties and concentrated wealth has a protective effect against homicide. Differences in neighborhood access to social and economic resources play a huge role in explaining homicide rates. And this is true in urban and rural areas. In rural areas, isolation and disconnection from resources can compound issues with violence. If you look at comparing the income disparity and victimization rates, the highest income disparity is actually in rural areas, not in urban areas. And looking at the role that trauma plays in this cycle, trauma is the overwhelming consequence of violence, and unaddressed trauma can greatly harm people's well-being, life prospects, and public safety. Responses to trauma, if unaddressed, can negatively impact people's lives in many ways, from difficulty achieving in school and at work to increasing the likelihood of violent and aggressive behavior. Research shows across the board that common responses to trauma of violence include stronger retaliatory beliefs, hyper-awareness of threats, normalizing violence as a way to solve problems, and perceiving harmless behavior as threatening. It becomes, it seems like the world is out to get you, as well as a difficulty in controlling aggression. And the biological responses to trauma may affect, lend insight into why trauma has these negative life effects. Trauma affects your brain. Your stress response becomes overstimulated while your brain struggles to extinguish fear responses, and it becomes increasingly sensitive to stress. And these neurological processes interfere with memory processing and what's called executive function, which is the ability to exhibit self-control, reasoning, problem solving, and planning. These effects of trauma, which interfere with school and work opportunities and make aggression more likely, show how untreated trauma feeds the cycle of poverty and violence in highly impacted communities. The research is clear. Violence, poverty, and trauma reinforce each other and disproportionately impact historically oppressed communities. As we've shown, people of color are disparately impacted by both violence and by poverty. The roots of these inequities are embedded in our history and continue to manifest in our institutions and attitudes in this day. It's critical to provide context about how generations of deprivation, oppression, and violence against people of color laid the groundwork for conditions that perpetuate violence today. Along with policies and practices that create economic disadvantage for communities of color, violence has played a key role in our country's legacy of oppression. Our system of government is built on a foundation of depriving people of color of their rights and controlling people of color through violence. The regime of slavery was upheld through violence at the hand of slave owners and the law. Native Americans were violently expelled from their land and slaughtered from the first contact with white explorers. Racial violence from white mobs was widespread during Reconstruction, targeting Black people in voting booths, churches, and their homes. And between the Civil War and World War II, thousands of Black people were lynched in public displays of racial hatred. Violence continued throughout the Civil Rights era and beyond, including attacks on civil rights activists and the bombing of Black churches throughout the South. And a major consequence of this shameful past is that generations of people of color were denied the same opportunities and human rights as white people, creating a cycle of entrenched racial inequity. Generations of people were also exposed to the destructive myth that Black people are dangerous and need to be controlled through violence. While that racial association might be more coded today, we continue to portray bad guys as Black people, and research shows that people tend to associate the concept of crime with Black male faces. Demonizing Black men as dangerous criminals who we fear make it easier for society to dismiss concerns about the limited opportunities that they face and the violent treatment that they receive at the hands of law enforcement, as well as the danger they confront in their own neighborhoods. While some may say that legalized discrimination is in the past, but you can see from this graphic that Black people were systematically denied their human rights from the vast majority of our nation's history. This has a deep cross-generational impact. White families were able to pursue educational opportunities, own land, build wealth, live freer from violence, and pass on this wealth accumulation to their children for hundreds of years when Black families were denied those same opportunities. There's also been a well-documented history of excessive use of force by law enforcement against people of color, violence that brings with it trauma that has the effects that we just talked about, and physical injury. It also undermines public safety by degrading trust in the law enforcement system. There are significant racial disparities in the criminal justice system at every step of the way. People of color, namely Black people, face harsher consequences than white people do. In Illinois, Black people are 7.5 times more likely than whites to get arrested for marijuana possession. Black people in Illinois are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. And in Chicago, an estimated 43% of Black men, that's 45,000 people, are quote-unquote missing due to incarceration or early death, leaving behind families and communities with reduced earning potential, missing caretakers, and significant trauma. Once someone becomes involved with the criminal justice system and becomes incarcerated, that experience is often traumatic in and of itself. There's high levels of sexual and physical assault in prison, documented abuses against people with mental illness, and the use of solitary confinement has been decried by the United Nations, the form of torture, and is still widely used in the United States. Criminal justice involvement creates real barriers to employment in addition to these traumatic barriers. The systematic barriers include barriers to getting a job, finding housing, including living in public housing, and other opportunities, which perpetuates poverty in many communities that have historically received some of the fewest resources. The tens of thousands of laws that limit opportunity for people with criminal records are meant to protect the public, but there's little evidence to back that up. And criminal justice involvement doesn't just have negative effects for the person involved. Having a parent who is incarcerated has negative impacts on children's lives. Parental incarceration has a notable role in increasing child poverty rates, child homelessness rates, and Black children in Illinois are 3.5 times more likely to have a parent who is incarcerated during their lifetime than white children. At the same time, 2 in 5 Black children in Illinois live in poverty. So where do we go from here? It's a lot of distressing information. But it's clear that violence and poverty often flourish under the same circumstances, including lack of access to jobs, inadequate investment in public services, poor health conditions, lack of educational opportunities, and more. And Illinois is not doing well at addressing these underlying quality of life issues. We have a long way to go that every Illinoisan has an adequate standard of living, free from poverty and violence. Given the high stakes involved with the violence crisis, it's literally life or death. It's tempting to look for quick fixes to address violence. But quick fixes often ignore the long-standing drivers of poverty and violence. We need a spectrum of interventions and approaches that includes prevention, intervention, enforcement, rehabilitation, and reentry. While we must stem the tide of the immediate crisis that we face, we cannot ignore the long-term conditions that foster violence. Focusing primarily on reducing violence by expanding policing and lengthening sentences exposes those in prison to human rights violations, perpetuates the inequities of our justice system, and reduces job and housing opportunities when they re-enter the community, nor does it stop violence before it starts. Relying on law enforcement to the exclusion of community investment runs the risk of deepening racial disparities that exist as a result of systematic issues in policing and criminal justice. For years, Illinois has eroded support for critical services that address these underlying conditions and has created structural barriers to opportunity for many struggling individuals and families. We recommend that Illinois make a priority of investing in services that will address the long-term drivers of poverty and violence, and this includes reforming the criminal justice system, investing in educational achievement and healthcare, increasing job quality and promoting employment opportunities, addressing the affordable housing crisis, and perhaps most importantly, passing a responsible budget that includes adequate revenue for these critical services. We need our leaders to take the political courage to come to a deal that includes adequate revenue. And one thing that you can use in your work that we want to share with you is that at our website, heartlandalliance.org/poverty report, we have county and community level data on all sorts of poverty indicators ranging from graduation rates to child poverty rates to unemployment, so that you can better understand the needs in your community and help make the case for the need for investing in anti-poverty services. Again, that's at our website, and it's available at the county level for all of Illinois and at the community area level for Chicago. And so I'm ready to take questions. And if you have, come up with a question later on, or you need more information, you can feel free to email me. So the first question is why Heartland decided to focus this year's report on poverty, violence, and trauma. Clearly, the issue of violence in Chicago has been at the top of everyone's minds, from the media to policymakers, all the way up to our president. And people are really grasping at straws to figure out what to do about the crisis of violence in Illinois, in Chicago notably. And we felt that, with our particular expertise in trauma-informed care and the causes of poverty, we needed to make these important connections between violence along with poverty and trauma. So many of the responses that have been proposed have been focused on short-term solutions, which are an important piece of the puzzle, but they're not sufficient. And at the same time, in the context of Illinois, politicians have been playing politics with our budget, which is a life and death situation for so many people who are impacted by poverty and violence. We wanted to make the case that these are interconnected, and that investing in an anti-poverty agenda is also investing in an anti-violence agenda. So there's a question about good data sources for youth experiencing violence. So I'm happy to follow up with whoever answered that question. There's state data that I could look at for you, and you could email me at Buitrago@heartlandalliance.org. It's on the screen. And then the question, why hasn't trauma been more widely recognized when it comes to creating policy in the past? I think that's a great question. It definitely should be recognized, and I think policymakers are starting to incorporate trauma into their decision-making. Specifically, Senator Durbin and Representative Danny Davis recently introduced a bill in Congress that would increase resources for trauma-informed care. And I think it's been easier to sort of classify people as good people and bad people when in reality, victims and perpetrators of violence are often the same people. And the role of trauma that people experience in their childhood and throughout their life course has not been incorporated into the narrative. But we're hoping to change that with this year's poverty report, or at least push the discussion in that direction. Final question, how can service providers and organizations use this report to help participants? Well, I think one way you can do that is to help your frontline staff understand, if they're not thinking about it already, the trauma that their clients or participants are likely to face who are coming in their doors. You might not specifically be an anti-violence provider, but many of the people you serve probably experience violence in their day-to-day lives. And I think looking at perhaps some training in trauma-informed care or some resources on that front can help craft more cohesive solutions to the issues that the people you serve are facing. And I think at the same time, we need voices of service providers in the policy discussion. And I think if this empowers you to talk to your policymakers and make the case that trauma, violence, and poverty are interconnected and that we need solutions that address all of them, we hope that it helps you do that. And if you'd like to get more directly involved with policy campaigns, feel free to email me and I'll put you in touch with our policy team who's doing really great work on these issues. Let me just see if there's any more questions. Sorry guys, 1 second. And the person who asked for specific data for counties on youth experiencing violence, if you have any more specific data requests, questions like that, we're happy to help you out with that. So feel free to just reach out to my email. and we can get you the data that you need. There's a lot of questions coming in, so we're just trying to sort it out. All right, so another question. What are some examples from other cities or countries of reducing violence and poverty in tandem, specifically gun violence? I think a lot of people are paying attention to what's happening in New York City, because they have made a lot of great gains in reducing gun violence without increasing invasive policing practices like stop and frisk. New York's very different from Chicago. We have different segregation, patterns. We have different levels of resources. But, I think there's stuff to be learned from the New York experience. And, I think Chicago does have a unique level of gun ownership. So community level policy changes that we hope, the question is, what are some community level policy changes that you hope this data will drive in Chicago facing an abrupt increase in violence this past year? So some of the things that we hope, like I talked about, is not Chicago level, but has a major impact in Chicago, is passing an adequate state budget that funds important services. I think we're also hoping that, one thing that we keep hearing about is really important is mental health and counseling services in schools themselves. There's been lots of cuts in mental health services for people living in poverty. And when someone, a child at a school is murdered, the fellow students are experiencing a lot of trauma, and there's often not adequate resources to help them process that trauma. So I think investment in schools, particularly mental health resources there, passing a state budget, and also trying to build pathways to employment opportunity, not only focusing on economic growth, but to help bridge the skills gap and train people who are at risk of violence to get the jobs that are growing in the Chicago area. And having those opportunities will help address the causes of both poverty and violence. All right. So, all right, I think that is all the questions that we have. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions that you sent and the responses. Again, if you have further questions or would like us to come out and talk to your community about these issues, we're happy to do so. And feel free to follow up with me with any thoughts that you have. So thank you again, and let me know if you need anything.